Chapter 1, New Currents. The bell above the door of Book Nook chimed, as it always did at precisely 7:55 a.m., announcing the arrival of Mrs. Flanders and the unofficial start to Tim's day. The scent of old paper, coffee, and lemon furniture polish hung in the air, familiar as his own skin. Tim perched on his usual stool behind the counter, half hidden by a fortress of stacked paperbacks, and greeted her with a two-finger salute. "Morning, Mrs. Flanders. The Illuminati called. They want their copy of Moby Dick back." She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and sniffed. "That's what they want you to think, Timothy, but the real secret's in the footnotes." Tim grinned, delighted. "I knew it. Melville was ahead of his time." His mother, shelving new arrivals in the poetry section, shot him a fond look over her shoulder. "Don't encourage her, Tim." "Encouragement is my middle name," he said, which was patently untrue. His middle name was Allen, but only Mrs. Flanders ever laughed at his jokes this early. By 8:15, the regulars had filtered in. Mr. Chen with his crossword puzzle, folded under one arm, Maya Patel, who left cryptic post-it notes in the self-help section, and old Mr. Brody, who never bought anything but always offered conspiracy theories about the mayor's dog. Tim loved these mornings, the banter, the weird comfort of routine, but as he zipped up his backpack and prepared to head for Ashgrove High, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. Maybe it was the way the wind rattled the shop's sign outside or how the sky looked bruised around the edges. He dismissed it as nerves. First day of junior year always felt like standing on the edge of something big, or maybe just weird. Ashgrove High greeted him with its usual cacophony, sneakers squeaking on linoleum, lockers slamming, voices bouncing off cinder-block walls. Tim navigated the chaos with practiced ease, weaving between clusters of friends and frenemies. He spotted Carlos near the trophy case, holding court with his usual entourage, a swirl of varsity jackets and nervous laughter. Carlos caught Tim's eye and flashed a crooked grin. "Timmy, you survived summer without burning down the store?" "I plead the fifth," Tim shot back. Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "You look taller." "That's my ego. It grew 3 inches over break." They shared a laugh, easy, familiar. Tim tried not to glance at his reflection in the glass case. Wild hair, 2 big ears, t-shirt with a faded X-Files logo. Not exactly varsity material. Carlos leaned in conspiratorially. "You hear about the new girl? Supposedly moved here from somewhere weird." "Define weird," Tim replied. Carlos shrugged. "Not Ashgrove, so basically Mars." Before Tim could retort, a ripple went through the hallway. A subtle shift in energy he felt more than saw. He turned just as a girl rounded the corner, backpack slung low, hair wind-tousled as if she'd walked through a storm no one else had noticed. She moved differently, unhurried but purposeful, eyes scanning everything with quiet intensity. The crowd parted without meaning to, curiosity trailing after her like static. "That's her," Carlos murmured. Tim watched as she paused before the trophy case, gaze lingering on a tarnished plaque from 1984. He didn't mean to move closer. He just did. And then, in a moment that would become legend by lunch period, he collided with her shoulder as she stepped sideways to avoid a freshman stampede. "Oof, sorry," he blurted, hands flailing for balance. She regarded him with cool amusement. "The wind warned me you were coming," she said softly. Tim blinked. "Did it? I must have missed the memo." She tilted her head as if listening for something only she could hear. It's easy to miss things when you're running too fast. He opened his mouth for another quip, but found himself oddly tongue-tied under her steady gaze. Her eyes were an ambiguous shade, gray-green maybe, and gave nothing away. "I'm Tim," he managed. "Windy," she said. He waited for a punchline that never came. "Well," he said finally, "welcome to Ashgrove High, where secrets go to die and rumors rise from the ashes." Windy smiled, just barely. "Or maybe they just get carried away by the wind." He snorted at that, relieved to find some footing. "Guess we'll have to keep an eye on any suspicious breezes." She studied him for a moment longer before turning away, leaving him staring after her as if she'd rearranged all the air molecules in her wake. By lunch period, Windy had become Ashgrove High's #1 trending topic. Tim overheard snippets everywhere. "She's from Oregon, or maybe Maine. She doesn't talk to anyone. Saw her reading alone in homeroom. Who does that? Bet she's hiding something." He found her at the edge of the courtyard beneath an ancient oak, eating an apple with deliberate slowness while sketching spirals in her notebook. Nobody else sat within 3 feet. Tim hesitated only a second before dropping onto the bench beside her. "Mind if I intrude?" he asked. Wendy shrugged. "It's your school." He took that as permission. "So, are you actually from Mars?" She looked up deadpan. "No, Mars is too noisy." Tim grinned despite himself. "Good answer." He pulled out his own lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and bag of pretzels, and tried not to stare as she drew another spiral. "So," he ventured, "what brings you to Ashgrove? Witness protection? Secret government mission? Joining our world-famous competitive lawn bowling team?" Wendy chewed thoughtfully before replying. "My mother got a job here." She paused, then added, "But I go where the wind takes me." Tim raised an eyebrow. "You say that like you mean it literally." "Maybe I do." He waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. "What are you drawing?" he asked instead. She angled her notebook so he could see, dozens of overlapping spirals and swirling lines, like tiny tornadoes trapped on paper. "It helps me listen," she said quietly. "To what?" She glanced up at the branches overhead, where leaves shivered in an invisible current. "Secrets in the wind." Tim snorted into his sandwich, couldn't help it, but caught himself when he saw she wasn't joking. "You can hear secrets? Like people's thoughts?" "Not thoughts," she considered her words carefully. "More like what people try not to say out loud, the things they wish would disappear." He tried to hide his skepticism behind another bite of sandwich, but failed miserably. "You don't believe me," Wendy observed. "It's not that," Tim hedged. "I'm just more of a show-me kind of guy." Wendy smiled faintly. "Most people are." Before Tim could reply, Carlos appeared at their table, seemingly conjured out of nowhere, with his trademark swagger and lopsided grin. "Am I interrupting something magical?" Carlos asked, sliding onto the bench opposite them without invitation. "Just debating whether Wendy here is psychic or merely poetic," Tim said. Carlos appraised Wendy with open curiosity. "Psychic's good for parties, but poetry gets you extra credit in Ms. Leary's class." He stuck out his hand. "Carlos Mendoza." Wendy shook it gravely. "Wendy Harper." Carlos glanced at Tim with raised eyebrows. "Harper, like harp, like music, like wind." And Tim could almost see his friend mentally cataloging every detail for future use. "So what brings you to our humble institution?" Carlos asked smoothly. "My mother teaches science," Wendy replied, offering nothing more. Carlos whistled low. "Brave woman." He leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. "You'll find Ashgrove's got more secrets than textbooks, and fewer answers than either." Wendy met his gaze evenly. "That's true everywhere." Carlos grinned wider. "I like her," he announced to Tim. "She's not scared off by your metaphors or my charm, which means she's either brilliant or dangerous." Tim rolled his eyes, but felt oddly pleased by their rapport. As they talked, bantering about cafeteria food conspiracies, "I swear they recycle tater tots," Carlos insisted. "Local legends, the haunted water tower got a mention, and which teachers were most likely robots, consensus Mr. Taylor." Tim became aware of how many eyes were on them. Snatches of whispered conversation drifted across the courtyard. "Is that the new girl? She's weird. Did you see who she's sitting with?" Wendy seemed oblivious or indifferent to the attention. She listened more than she spoke, occasionally tilting her head as if tuning into some distant frequency only she could hear. At one point, a gust of wind swept through the courtyard, scattering napkins and rattling branches overhead. Wendy closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if gathering strength from it, while Carlos watched her with open fascination, and Tim tried and failed not to notice how everything seemed to swirl around her presence. When lunch ended and students began drifting back inside, Carlos nudged Tim with his elbow. "She's interesting," he murmured under his breath. "She's something," Tim agreed. Wendy stood abruptly, gathering her things with unhurried grace. Before leaving, she looked back at them both and said quietly, "Careful what you say when the wind is listening." Then she slipped away into the tide of students, a ripple in Ashgrove's otherwise predictable current. The rest of the day passed in a haze of rumor and speculation. Teachers glancing curiously at Wendy as she answered questions in clipped but precise sentences. Students inventing increasingly elaborate stories about where she'd come from or what she might be hiding. Even Principal Harmon pausing outside her math class for longer than usual before moving on with a frown. Tim caught glimpses of her between classes, always alone but never lost, always watching, but rarely seen watching back. By last bell, Ashgrove High was abuzz with new energy, a restlessness that felt both exciting and dangerous. As Tim headed out into the parking lot, Carlos at his side naturally, he found himself scanning the horizon for any sign of Wendy Harper, not sure if he wanted to ask another question or just listen for whatever secrets might be carried on Ashgrove's restless wind. Either way, he had a feeling this year was going to be anything but ordinary. The wind picked up as they walked home together, carrying dust, rumors, and possibilities through streets lined with sycamores and faded porch flags. Somewhere behind them, someone whispered Wendy's name as if it were both warning and invitation. Tim shivered despite himself, not from cold but from anticipation, and wondered what else might be waiting to be heard if only he learned how to listen. He glanced sideways at Carlos, whose grin was already plotting tomorrow's mischief, then up at clouds scudding across an unsettled sky, then back at Ashgrove High receding behind them, a place suddenly full of secrets and strangers and stories waiting to be told. And somewhere ahead, or maybe all around them, the wind kept whispering its promises. Change is coming. Tim squared his shoulders and followed it home. Chapter 2. The missing piece, Monday morning at Ashgrove High, was always a patchwork of sluggish yawns and half-eaten bagels, but today a different energy fizzed in the air. Tim felt it before he understood it, an undercurrent of uncertainty that tangled with the usual routine. As he passed through the front doors, he caught sight of knots of students clustered near the office, their voices pitched higher than normal. "Did you hear?" someone whispered. Tim slowed, curiosity prickling his skin. Carlos materialized at his side, slapping a hand on Tim's shoulder. "You look like you just saw a ghost," Carlos said, his grin a little too broad for the hour. Tim shrugged off the hand. "Feels more like I'm walking into a murder mystery. What's going on?" Carlos jerked his head toward the main hallway. "Mr. Hargrove didn't show up for first period. Sub says nobody's heard from him since Friday." Tim blinked. "Hargrove? He's never even late for fire drills." "That's what I'm saying." Carlos leaned in, lowering his voice. "People are freaking out. Somebody said he left his car in the lot all weekend." A ripple of unease worked its way down Tim's spine. Mr. Hargrove had taught English at Ashgrove for nearly 2 decades. He was famous for quoting Shakespeare during pep rallies and giving out extra credit if you could make him laugh during poetry readings. The idea of him just vanishing didn't compute. "Maybe he's sick?" Tim offered, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. Carlos gave him a sidelong look. "Sick with what? Sudden urge to disappear?" A bell rang overhead, jolting them both into motion. As they made their way toward homeroom, Tim caught glimpses of teachers huddled in corners, eyes darting, voices hushed. The tension was contagious. Even the usual hallway hecklers seemed subdued. By third period, theories had multiplied like rabbits. In the cafeteria line, Maya Patel insisted she'd seen Mr. Hargrove arguing with Principal Harmon after school on Friday. In gym, someone claimed he'd been spotted at Miller's Woods late at night, talking to himself. The wildest rumor came courtesy of Tommy Bledsoe, who swore his older brother, an assistant manager at the gas station, had seen police cars outside Hargrove's house that morning. "Next thing you know," Carlos muttered as they slid into their seats for algebra, "they'll say he was abducted by aliens." Tim grinned in spite of himself. "If so, I hope they brought him good coffee." But beneath the banter, his mind spun with possibilities. He glanced across the room and caught Wendy's profile, serene as ever, eyes fixed on her open notebook. She was sketching spirals again, pen moving in slow, deliberate circles. At lunch, Tim found her in her usual spot beneath the oak tree, the wind tugging at her hair and scattering apple blossoms across her notebook. He dropped onto the bench beside her without preamble. "So, what does the wind say about Mr. Hargrove?" Wendy didn't look up from her drawing. "It says people lose things all the time." "That's not an answer," Tim protested. "It's the only one I have right now." He studied her face, calm, unreadable, and tried a different tack. "You really believe you can hear secrets?" Wendy finally looked at him, eyes narrowed as if searching for something in his expression. "Don't you ever sense things other people miss?" Tim hesitated. He wanted to scoff, to make a joke, but there was something in her gaze that stopped him. I guess, he admitted quietly. Sometimes. She nodded once and returned to her spirals. Carlos appeared then, dropping his tray on the table with a clatter and sliding in next to Tim. So what's our resident oracle got to say about all this? Carlos asked, nodding at Wendy with mock solemnity. Wendy ignored him. Tim smirked. Apparently, we're all just losing things left and right. Carlos rolled his eyes. If she starts talking about Mercury in retrograde, I'm out. Wendy set down her pen and regarded Carlos with mild curiosity. You don't actually believe any of this matters to you, she said softly. Carlos froze mid-chew. What's that supposed to mean? She tilted her head, studying him as if he were a puzzle piece turned the wrong way. You like being in the middle of things, as long as you're not responsible for what happens next. Carlos bristled, but tried to cover it with bravado. That's so? Maybe I just don't buy into spooky stories. Wendy smiled faintly, a brief upturn of her lips that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Tim watched them both, feeling the tension twist between them like a live wire. So, Tim said, forcing lightness into his voice. What do we do? Wait around for Hargrove to stroll back in with sunburn and a story about getting lost in the woods? Carlos leaned forward, elbows on knees. I say we figure out what really happened. Wendy arched an eyebrow. Why? Carlos shrugged. Because everyone else is just making stuff up, and because I'm bored. Tim grinned at that. Classic Carlos logic. Wendy tore a page from her notebook and handed it to Tim, a swirl of spirals with a single word written in neat script at the center. Listen. He frowned at it, confused. Wendy stood abruptly and gathered her things. If you want answers, she said quietly, stop talking long enough to hear them. Then she walked away, leaving Tim and Carlos staring after her. Carlos whistled low under his breath. She's good. Tim tucked the note into his pocket and stood as well. Come on. Where are we going? To listen, Tim said, surprising himself with how serious he sounded. The courtyard was nearly empty by the time they found Wendy again, this time behind the gymnasium, where the wind funneled between brick walls and made strange music with the chain-link fence. Wendy leaned against the wall, arms folded across her chest as if she'd been expecting them. Tim cleared his throat. Okay, prove it. She regarded him with mild amusement. Prove what? That you can hear things, secrets or whatever. He tried for bravado but felt suddenly exposed under her steady gaze. Wendy didn't move for a moment. Then she closed her eyes and let the wind tangle through her hair. You're afraid people will find out you care more than you pretend, she said softly, so quietly it might have been mistaken for wind itself. Tim felt heat rise in his cheeks. Carlos shot him a sidelong glance, but said nothing. And you, Wendy continued, turning to Carlos, pretend everything is a game so no one notices when you're scared. Carlos opened his mouth to retort, but stopped. Something unspoken flickered behind his eyes. Tim forced a laugh that came out brittle. Okay, so you're observant. Wendy smiled without humor. Observation is just another kind of listening. A silence settled between them, awkward but charged. Finally, Carlos broke it with a shrug. Fine, you win. He flashed his trademark grin, though it looked a bit forced around the edges. But if you're so good at hearing things, what about Mr. Hargrove? What do you know that nobody else does? Wendy looked past them toward the rustling sycamores beyond the fence. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. Sometimes people don't leave because they want to be gone. Sometimes they're taken by something nobody sees coming. She paused, then added, sometimes the wind carries more than leaves. The words hung between them, heavy and unsettling. Tim swallowed hard, glancing at Carlos for reassurance, but finding none. Are you saying someone took him? Tim asked quietly. Wendy shook her head once, a tiny gesture that somehow conveyed both certainty and doubt. I'm saying nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Carlos tried to lighten the mood with a joke. Well, that clears things up, but even he couldn't muster much enthusiasm. They stood together in uneasy silence as the wind kicked up around them, swirling dust and secrets through the narrow alleyway behind the gym. Finally, Wendy pushed off from the wall and started walking away. Wait, Tim called after her. She paused but didn't turn around. If you hear anything else, will you tell us? She hesitated, a heartbeat longer than necessary, then nodded once before disappearing around the corner. Carlos let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She gives me chills," he muttered. Tim stared after Wendy for a long moment, fingers absently tracing the spiral on the note she'd given him. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." The rest of the day unfolded in fragments. Teachers struggling to maintain order, students whispering wild theories, Principal Harmon making vague announcements over the intercom about respecting privacy while investigations were underway. It all felt surreal, a town holding its breath while waiting for news nobody wanted to hear. After last bell, Tim lingered by his locker until Carlos sauntered over, backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. "You still thinking about what Wendy said?" Carlos asked casually, though his eyes were sharp with curiosity. Tim nodded. "It just doesn't add up." Carlos grinned crookedly. "That's Ashgrove for you. Nothing ever does." They walked out together into the late afternoon sun, shadows stretching long across cracked pavement. As they reached the edge of campus, Tim glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see Wendy standing there beneath the oaks or listening to secrets only she could hear. But she was nowhere in sight. Only the wind moved through empty spaces where answers should have been. That evening at Book Nook, Tim sat behind the counter pretending to do homework while replaying every word Wendy had said. His mother bustled nearby, humming tunelessly as she restocked shelves. Outside, dusk pressed against dusty windows like a held breath. The bell above the door chimed. A customer, or maybe just another echo of routine, but Tim barely noticed. He pulled Wendy's spiral sketch from his pocket and traced its lines with thoughtful fingers. "Listen," it said. He wondered what he was supposed to hear, and whether he'd recognize it when it finally arrived on Ashgrove's restless wind. As darkness fell across Ashgrove and porch lights winked on one by one, rumors grew roots and tangled through quiet streets. Somewhere out there was an answer, or maybe just another secret waiting to be carried away by whatever storm was coming next. And for reasons he couldn't quite name yet, Tim knew he'd be listening for every whisper that followed. Nop Chapter 3. Echoes and Alibis. Ashgrove High was a rumor mill running at full tilt. By Tuesday, the whispers about Mr. Hargrove's disappearance had mutated into something feral. Tim heard it in the way lockers slammed, harder, more urgent. He saw it in the darting eyes of students and teachers alike, as if everyone half expected the missing teacher to materialize from thin air, trailing secrets like autumn leaves. He found Carlos at their usual spot outside the cafeteria, leaning against a pillar with the bored confidence of someone who knew all the back channels. Carlos greeted him with a lopsided grin, but his eyes were scanning the crowd, always searching for leverage. "You hear what they're saying now?" Carlos asked, not waiting for an answer. Supposedly, Hargrove was in debt to some sketchy people, or he was writing a tell-all about the school board, or get this, he was having an affair with Ms. Leary. Tim snorted. "If that's true, I'll eat my X-Files shirt." Carlos smirked. "You'd better hope it's not polyester." But even as they joked, Tim could feel the tension thrumming under every word. Ashgrove was hungry for answers, and in the absence of facts, rumors multiplied like mold. It was during third period history that fate, or perhaps someone's well-intentioned meddling, intervened. Mrs. Dorsey, the guidance counselor, swept into class with her clipboard and her signature scent of lavender and dry erase marker. She surveyed the room, lips pursed, before zeroing in on Tim. "Timothy Walker," she said, "and Wendy Harper, your partners for the local history project." A ripple of interest passed through the classroom. Wendy, seated near the window, barely looked up from her notebook. Tim raised a hand. "Isn't there a sign-up sheet?" Mrs. Dorsey offered a tight smile. "I thought I'd mix things up this year. Maybe you two can help each other stay focused." Her gaze lingered on Wendy for a beat too long, a silent message that didn't need translating. Tim felt every pair of eyes in the room flicker between him and Wendy. Skepticism, curiosity, envy. He glanced over at her, trying to read her reaction, but she was inscrutable as ever. After school, Tim found Wendy waiting by the library doors, backpack slung low and hair tangled by the breeze that always seemed to follow her. She didn't acknowledge him right away. Instead, she traced her finger along the brick wall, as if feeling for hidden messages. "Ready to dive into Ashgrove's thrilling past?" Tim asked as he approached. Wendy regarded him with that sideways look of hers, half amusement, half challenge. Isn't history just a collection of secrets people stopped bothering to hide? Depends on who's telling it, Tim replied. Come on, let's see what skeletons are rattling around in the archives. The library was nearly deserted, just Mrs. Kwan at the circulation desk and a freshman asleep over a pile of textbooks. Dust motes spun in late afternoon sunlight as Tim led the way to a table tucked between shelves of local history books and yearbooks dating back to the 1940s. Wendy set her notebook down with deliberate care. So how do you want to do this? Tim grinned, pulling out a stack of old yearbooks. Rapid-fire questions. I ask, you answer. Then you ask me. She arched an eyebrow. Interrogation technique? Call it icebreaker roulette. Wendy considered this for a moment, then nodded once. All right, Tim said, flipping open a yearbook at random. Favorite historical figure? Wendy's lips twitched. The wind. Tim groaned theatrically. That's not a person. It moves things without being seen, she replied quietly. Isn't that what most history does? He tried not to let her get under his skin. She had a way of answering questions with riddles, turning every conversation into a labyrinth. Okay, he pressed on. If you could ask anyone in Ashgrove one question and get a true answer, who would it be? Wendy's pencil hovered over her spiral sketch. My mother, she said after a pause. That caught Tim off guard. He'd been expecting Principal Harmon or even Hargrove himself. What would you ask? Wendy smiled without warmth. Why she really moved us here. Tim blinked at that but decided not to push further. He knew what it was like to have questions you weren't ready to voice aloud. Wendy flipped the script. Your turn. Why do you want to know what happened to Mr. Hargrove? Tim hesitated, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. The honest answer felt too raw, because if someone like Hargrove could just vanish, maybe nobody was safe, even people who were supposed to be permanent fixtures. He settled for a half-truth, because nothing else makes sense right now. Wendy studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if she understood more than he'd said. They worked in fits and starts, Wendy scanning old newspaper clippings with silent intensity, Tim reading aloud snippets from yearbooks. Did you know Ashgrove's marching band won state in 1987? That was apparently our cultural peak. Every so often, he tried another question. Do you really believe secrets can be heard? Wendy didn't look up from her page. Not all secrets are spoken aloud. Then how do you find them? She shrugged slightly. You listen for what's missing, the empty spaces between words. Tim mulled that over as he thumbed through an article about Ashgrove's founding families, names that still dotted street signs and mailboxes. So what's missing here? He asked quietly. Wendy finally met his gaze. People talk about Mr. Hargrove like he was everyone's favorite uncle, but nobody seems to know anything real about him. Tim frowned. She wasn't wrong. All day, he'd heard stories about Hargrove's quirks and classroom jokes, but nothing about his life outside school. You think he had enemies? Tim asked. Wendy's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Everyone has someone who wishes they were gone, even if they don't admit it. Tim shivered, not from cold, but from the way her words seemed to echo in the silent library. Meanwhile, across town, Carlos was doing what he did best, listening in places nobody expected him to be. At the gas station, where his cousin worked afternoons, Carlos loitered near the snack racks, ears tuned to rapid-fire Spanish exchange between employees and customers alike. El maestro que falta, dicen que la policía preguntó por él. The missing teacher, they say the police asked about him. Carlos filed that away, a thread to pull later. At football practice, he drifted along the sidelines, eavesdropping on upperclassmen swapping gossip between drills. Heard Hargrove got in trouble with Harmon last semester. Something about those essays he published online. Nah, man, I heard he was snooping around Miller's Woods at night. Carlos listened, storing every scrap of rumor like puzzle pieces in his mental filing cabinet. After practice, he cornered Maya Patel by the vending machines. You know anything about Hargrove? He asked casually. Maya hesitated just long enough to confirm his suspicion that she did. I heard he called Ms. Leary late Friday night, she whispered. She sounded upset when I saw her Monday morning. Carlos grinned, flashing his easy charm. You're the best, Maya. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Back at the library, Wendy leaned forward suddenly, voice low and urgent. Do you ever wonder why people really keep secrets? She asked. Tim blinked at her intensity. To protect themselves or someone else? She shook her head slightly. Sometimes it's because they don't want to admit what they already know. Tim tried to meet her gaze but found himself looking away first. A heavy silence settled between them until Wendy broke it by closing her notebook with a snap. I think we've found enough for today, she said quietly. He wanted to protest, to keep pushing until she gave him something solid, but instead he nodded and gathered his things. As they stepped out into the fading light, Tim risked one more question. Do you trust anyone here? Wendy considered this as they walked side by side down the nearly empty hallway. I trust what I hear, she said at last, even when I wish I didn't. That night, Tim sprawled across his bed with textbooks scattered around him and his phone buzzing on the pillow beside his head. Carlos's name flashed on screen. Carlos, you up? Tim tapped out a reply. Tim, barely. What's up? The phone rang almost immediately. Carlos never did like texting when things got serious. Tim answered on the second ring. Let me guess. You found out Hargrove is actually a Russian spy. Carlos snorted softly on the other end. Nothing that cool. But people are talking, like really talking. Tim propped himself up on one elbow. About what? Carlos lowered his voice conspiratorially, even though nobody else could hear them. I heard Miss Leary crying in her car after school today. Maya says it's about Hargrove. Tim frowned at the ceiling tiles above his bed. You think they were involved? Or maybe just friends, Carlos said quickly. But here's the thing, there's stuff nobody wants to say out loud. Like Principal Harmon yelling at Hargrove last week, and now Harmon's acting all jumpy whenever anyone mentions his name. Tim chewed his lip thoughtfully. Everyone keeps saying how much they liked Hargrove, but it feels fake somehow. Carlos grunted agreement. I think people are lying, to themselves or each other. A pause stretched between them before Tim spoke again. You think Wendy knows more than she lets on? Carlos hesitated just long enough for Tim to notice. I think she sees things differently. That doesn't mean she's dangerous. He paused again before adding softly, but maybe we should be careful anyway. Tim turned that over in his mind, the thought that trusting Wendy could be as risky as not trusting her. Yeah, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should. For a moment neither spoke, only the faint hiss of static filled the line, a ghostly echo of wind moving through wires. I'll keep digging, Carlos said eventually, voice steady but subdued. Me too, Tim replied. They hung up without saying goodbye, a silent agreement forged in uncertainty and shared suspicion. As midnight crept over Ashgrove and shadows pooled beneath streetlights outside his window, Tim lay awake listening for anything unusual. The whistle of wind through cracked glass, distant voices carried on restless currents. He thought of Wendy's spirals and riddles, of Carlos sifting rumors like gold dust, of Mr. Hargrove smiling behind stacks of battered books in room 213, now just another empty space waiting to be filled by whatever truth might come next. Somewhere out there were answers, or maybe just more secrets twisting through Ashgrove like wind through autumn trees. Either way, Tim knew sleep would not come easily tonight, not while echoes and alibis haunted every corner of his mind and every shadowed street beyond his window. And not while trust itself felt like just another secret waiting for its moment to be revealed. Chapter 4. Secrets on the Wind. The storm announced itself in the early afternoon, a low rumble that made the windows of Book Nook shudder in their frames. Tim's mother glanced up from her ledger, lips pursed. If that thunder knocks the power out again, we're closing early, she warned. But Tim was already halfway out the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, mind elsewhere. He could feel the change in the air, the way the wind pressed against his skin, sharp and insistent, as if trying to tell him something urgent. The sky hung heavy with bruised clouds, and every step toward Miller's Woods felt like moving deeper into a story he wasn't sure he wanted to read. He hadn't planned to go there, not really. But after another morning of rumors, Ms. Leary absent, Principal Harmon stalking the halls with a face like carved stone, students whispering wild theories about Mr. Hargrove's last night, Tim found his feet carrying him away from school, past the edge of town, and into the dense hush of cottonwoods, where secrets were said to hide. Miller's Woods was an old place, The kind of place every Ashgrove kid grew up hearing stories about. Haunted barns, ghost lights, the echo of footsteps where nobody walked. In daylight, it was just trees and tangled undergrowth and the dry creek bed winding through the center. But now, with storm clouds gathering and the wind rising, it felt charged, alive in a way that made Tim's heart thump harder in his chest. He ducked beneath low branches slick with rain and paused by the old cottonwood at the wood's heart. A gust of wind whipped his hair into his eyes and he blinked, then caught sight of Windy standing on the far side of the clearing, her back to him. She looked as though she belonged here, hair loose and wild, jacket flapping in the wind, hands tucked into her pockets as she stared up at the trembling canopy. She didn't turn when he approached, but somehow he knew she'd heard him coming. "Didn't expect to see you here," Tim said, trying for casual but only managing breathless. Windy's voice was low and even. "Most people avoid this place when storms roll in." "I'm not most people," Tim replied, then regretted it, too defensive. He shoved his hands in his pockets and watched as Windy tilted her head back, eyes closed, lips parted as if tasting the air. "The wind's different today," she murmured. Tim hesitated. "Does it say anything? Or is that just your way of telling me I'm late?" A faint smile flickered across Windy's lips. "It's never just one thing." They stood together in silence for a moment, listening to the wind rattle through leaves overhead. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped with a sound like distant gunfire. Tim let out a shaky laugh. "You know, if someone finds my body out here tomorrow, promise you'll tell them I was investigating local folklore and not just running away from algebra homework." Windy glanced at him sidelong. "Is that why you're here? To chase stories?" Tim shrugged, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt under her gaze. "Maybe I just wanted to see if there was anything real behind all these secrets." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Or maybe I just didn't want to be ordinary." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. For a moment, Windy's expression softened. She looked almost vulnerable. "I know what that feels like," she said softly. "People expecting you to fit somewhere and knowing you never really will." Tim scuffed his shoe against a root. "Is that why you listen to the wind? Because it doesn't care who you are?" Windy shook her head. "I listen because I can't help it." She paused, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Sometimes I wish I could ignore it, just be normal for a while. But it's always there. All those secrets people try so hard to bury." Tim studied her face, the way shadows moved across her features, the tension in her jaw, and realized how little he actually knew about her beyond the rumors and riddles. "Can you really hear things?" he asked quietly. Windy didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached down and plucked a fallen leaf from the ground, holding it up between them. "My grandmother used to tell me that every leaf holds a story," she said. "When the wind blows through them, it carries pieces of what people leave behind, wishes, regrets, things they're too scared to say out loud." Tim tried to picture that, a world where every breeze brought secrets swirling around your ears. It sounded exhausting. "So what's the wind saying now?" he asked. Windy turned slowly in a circle, eyes half closed as if tuning into some frequency only she could sense. When she spoke again, her voice was barely louder than the rustling leaves. "It says someone came through here last Friday night, running fast, heart pounding, someone afraid of being followed." Tim felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You mean Mr. Hargrove?" Windy didn't answer directly. Instead, she stepped closer to the old cottonwood and traced her fingers along its scarred bark. "There are echoes everywhere," she said softly, "if you know how to listen." They moved deeper into the woods together, following the dry creek bed as thunder rumbled overhead. Tim found himself telling Windy stories, half-remembered legends about Miller's Woods, the girl who vanished on prom night, the farmer who claimed to have seen ghostly lights hovering above the barn, tales of lost things turning up years later in places nobody could explain. Windy listened without interrupting, eyes distant but intent. "My dad used to say this place was haunted by bad decisions." Tim joked weakly as they picked their way over a tangle of roots. Windy smiled faintly. "Maybe that's true for every place people go to hide." They stopped at a clearing, where the remains of an old fence slouched beneath a stand of willows. The wind picked up again, a sudden gust that sent leaves spiraling around their feet. Wendy closed her eyes and pressed her palms flat against her thighs. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Tim strained to listen, at first hearing only the wind and distant thunder, then faintly, almost imagined, voices overlapping and indistinct like echoes bouncing off water. He shivered. "What is it?" Wendy opened her eyes slowly. "Fragments," she said, "pieces of conversations left behind." She took a shaky breath. "Someone was arguing here, not long ago." "Arguing with who?" Tim pressed. Wendy shook her head helplessly. "I can't tell. It's like trying to catch smoke." They stood together in uneasy silence until another voice broke through, the sharp crackle of brush behind them. Carlos emerged from the trees, hair plastered damp to his forehead, hoodie pulled tight against the wind. "Figured I'd find you two out here," he called, voice pitched high enough to sound casual but edged with something else. Worry or maybe annoyance. Tim blinked in surprise. "How'd you know where we were?" Carlos snorted. "You think people don't talk? Half the school says you two were headed this way." He jerked his chin at Wendy. "Besides, I figured if anyone was going to get struck by lightning chasing ghost stories, it'd be you." Wendy regarded Carlos with open curiosity. "You followed rumors." Carlos grinned crookedly. "Best GPS there is." He glanced around at the clearing, then back at Tim. "So, what did I miss?" Tim hesitated, unsure how much to share, but Wendy spoke first. "We think Mr. Hargrove might have come through here Friday night," she said quietly. Carlos whistled low. "You get that from your sixth sense, or just reading footprints?" "Both," Wendy replied without irony. Carlos sighed and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Look, I get wanting answers as much as anyone else, but maybe we should stop chasing shadows and start looking for something real." He glanced meaningfully at Tim before adding, "There's an old barn on the other side of these woods, place everyone says is haunted or cursed or whatever." Tim frowned. "The one by Holloway Road?" Carlos nodded. "My cousin says cops were sniffing around there Saturday morning, looking for something." He looked pointedly at Wendy. "If Hargrove was hiding out or meeting someone, that'd be my guess where he went." The three stood in uneasy silence while rain pattered through branches overhead. Wendy finally broke it. "If we go together, we might find something none of us could alone." Tim shot Carlos a look, half excitement, half fear, but Carlos just shrugged. "Three's better than one," Carlos agreed gruffly. Tim drew a shaky breath. "And we all promise no more keeping secrets from each other?" Wendy nodded solemnly. Carlos hesitated only a moment before giving a half salute. "Scout's honor," he said lightly, but his eyes were serious. Thunder cracked above them, a warning or maybe an omen, and somewhere far off came another rush of wind through trees, insistent, urgent, full of voices only some would ever hear. As they picked their way back toward town, mud squelching beneath their sneakers and hearts pounding with new resolve, Tim wondered what waited for them at that abandoned barn and whether some secrets really did want to stay hidden. But for now, for this moment, they were united by purpose, if not by trust. Three outsiders circling closer to whatever truth haunted Ashgrove's restless woods. The storm rolled on overhead as they disappeared beneath swaying branches, leaving only whispers on the wind behind them. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, The Barn and the Bargain. Dusk pressed against Ashgrove like a bruise, the last light bruising the sky in streaks of purple and gold as Tim, Wendy, and Carlos crept along the edge of Miller's Woods. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the tangle of branches overhead. Every footstep was a calculated risk, the wet grass slick, the silence around them broken only by the occasional caw of a crow or the distant hum of cars on Holloway Road. They moved together but apart, each caught in their own orbit. Tim led by instinct more than certainty, his heart thudding with a mix of dread and anticipation. Carlos lagged half a step behind, hands thrust deep into his hoodie pockets, eyes darting to every shadow. Wendy walked in the middle, her movements unhurried, head tilted as if listening for something beyond the reach of ordinary ears. The barn emerged from the trees like a shipwrecked ghost, half collapsed, its roof sagging and boards gone silver gray with age. Weeds and wildflowers choked its foundation. A single length of rusted chain hung from what remained of the doors, swaying gently in a breeze that smelled of rain and secrets. Carlos let out a low whistle. "Place looks even creepier than I remember." Tim shot him a look. You've been here before? Carlos shrugged, trying for nonchalance. Once, on a dare. Never made it past the front door. Wendy didn't pause. She slipped through a gap in the boards as if drawn by invisible threads, her silhouette swallowed by darkness. Tim hesitated only long enough to glance at Carlos, who rolled his eyes but followed anyway. Inside, the air was thick with rot and dust, the floor littered with broken glass and old beer cans. Faded graffiti scrawled across the walls. Names, dates, a spray-painted spiral that made Tim's skin prickle. The beams overhead creaked in the wind, and somewhere far above an owl hooted, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hush. Tim clicked on his phone flashlight, casting a narrow beam that caught on splinters and shadows. "Stick close," he muttered, voice too loud in the gloom. Carlos grinned tightly. "Don't worry, I'm not looking to get murdered tonight." Wendy ignored them both. She knelt beside a pile of debris near the back wall, fingers sifting through leaves and scraps of cloth with deliberate care. Tim joined her, crouching low. "See something?" She didn't answer at first. Her hand paused over a scrap of fabric, plaid, frayed at one edge and stained a rusty brown that made Tim's stomach twist. Carlos hovered behind them. "What is that?" Wendy held it up to the light. It was unmistakably part of a scarf, one Tim recognized instantly from Mr. Hargrove's wardrobe, red and blue checks, the kind he wore even in warm weather. Tim's mouth went dry. "That's his." Wendy nodded once. Eyes unreadable. Carlos shifted uneasily. "Could be anyone's." Tim shook his head. "Not here. Not like this." He reached out to touch it but stopped short, suddenly afraid to make it real. They fell silent, all three staring at the scrap as if it might start speaking on its own. A gust rattled the barn's walls. Dust whirled up in lazy spirals. Wendy closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. "Someone wanted us to find this," she said quietly. Carlos scoffed, but his bravado sounded forced. "Or someone dropped it running away from whatever happened here." Wendy straightened, tucking the scarf piece into her pocket. "No," she said softly. "It was left as a message." Tim looked around, noticing details he'd missed at first. More graffiti, some fresh, some decades old, overlapping messages layered like palimpsests. One phrase leapt out at him in jagged black paint. "Not all who leave are gone." He pointed it out to Wendy and Carlos. "That wasn't here last year," he whispered. Carlos frowned. "You sure? I came here once with Maya. Her brother dared us." Tim's voice shook despite himself. "I remember this wall was just names before." Wendy traced the words with her fingertip. "It's meant for someone who knows how to look." A shiver ran through Tim that had nothing to do with the cold. Carlos stepped back, scanning the barn nervously. "Okay, so what now? We found something." He gestured at Wendy's pocket, then at the graffiti. "But what does it mean?" Wendy turned to face them both fully for the first time since entering. Her eyes were luminous in the dim light, her expression unusually intense. "It means we're not chasing shadows anymore," she said. "Something happened here, and someone wants us to know it." Thunder rumbled distantly, a reminder that the storm was never far away. Tim tried to steady his breathing. "But who, and why leave clues for us?" Wendy's gaze flickered between them. "Because we're listening when others aren't." Carlos laughed sharply, a brittle sound that echoed off splintered rafters. "Listening? To what? Ghosts?" Wendy didn't blink. "To everything people try to hide." A charged silence followed. Tim broke it with a question that had been gnawing at him since they entered. "Wendy, is there something you're not telling us? You always seem to know more than you say." Wendy met his eyes without flinching. "There are things I can't explain, not in ways that would make sense to you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "But I promise I'm not working against you." Carlos snorted softly but didn't argue. Tim pressed on, voice trembling. "If we're going to keep doing this, we can't keep secrets from each other. Not anymore." Carlos nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, no more riddles." Wendy looked at them both for a long moment. So long, Tim wondered if she'd just walk away again. But then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said finally. "No more lies." A gust swept through the barn then, strong enough to rattle loose boards and send dust swirling around their feet. Wendy closed her eyes, lips moving silently as if in prayer or concentration. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, almost reverent. "The wind says," she paused as if listening to something just beyond hearing. "The night Hargrove disappeared, he met someone here, a friend who became an enemy." Tim felt goosebumps rise along his arms. Who? Wendy opened her eyes, pupils wide and dark as midnight. The answer is close, closer than we think. Her gaze lingered on Tim for a heartbeat before shifting to Carlos. Carlos swallowed hard but managed a crooked smile. So we're dealing with someone inside Ashgrove? Wendy nodded once. Tim tried to process it all. The scarf scrap, the graffiti message, Wendy's certainty that someone was watching them even now. We need to be careful, he said finally. Carlos clapped him on the shoulder with forced cheerfulness. Careful's my middle name. Wendy smiled faintly, but didn't laugh. They stood together in the fading light, the three of them bound now by more than curiosity or shared suspicion, by a pact forged in fear and necessity. The wind picked up again, howling through cracks in the barn walls, until it almost sounded like voices whispering just out of reach. Tim shivered and turned toward Wendy. What did it say exactly? The wind? She looked at him as if weighing how much truth he could bear. It said, "Ask who brings apples when none are hungry. Seek who hides pain behind laughter's mask." Carlos blinked in confusion. Is that supposed to mean something? Wendy shrugged slightly, but her eyes were troubled. It's a riddle, but I think it points to someone close to Mr. Hargrove, someone everyone trusts but nobody really sees. Tim's mind raced. Ms. Leary? Principal Harmon? Someone else entirely? He glanced at Carlos, whose face was unreadable in the shifting shadows. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the barn for an instant before plunging them back into gloom. We'll figure it out, Tim said quietly, more promise than certainty. Wendy nodded once more and tucked her hair behind her ear, listening intently as if waiting for another message from beyond. They left the barn together, the scarf scrap wrapped in Wendy's hand like an unspoken vow, emerging into night just as rain began to fall again in soft sheets. As they hurried back toward town beneath dripping branches and flickering streetlights, Tim felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter for having spoken his fears aloud, heavier for knowing how much further they had yet to go. Behind them, the barn stood silent, its secrets safe for now, except for those willing to listen closely enough to hear what was hidden on the restless Ashgrove wind. And above them, thunder rolled once more, a warning or an omen, as their pact echoed into the darkness. No more lies between us. Whatever came next would come for all three together. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, Unraveling Threads. The morning after their pact in the barn, Ashgrove's sky was scrubbed clean and bright, as if the storm had washed away not just dust and pollen, but every trace of certainty. Tim awoke with Wendy's riddle echoing in his head. Ask who brings apples when none are hungry. Seek who hides pain behind laughter's mask. He turned it over as he dressed, as he poured coffee for his mother at Book Nook, as he watched regulars trade theories about Mr. Hargrove's fate. At school, the buzz was undiminished. If anything, the barn discovery, kept secret between the trio, seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of every conversation. Tim noticed it in sideways glances, in the way teachers' voices faltered when taking attendance, in the way Ms. Leary's desk sat empty and Principal Harmon prowled the halls with a scowl carved deep into his brow. Carlos met him at his locker, sliding a folded note into Tim's palm with practiced subtlety. "For your eyes only," he whispered. Tim unfolded it, a list of names and times, faculty, custodians, students, each with a cryptic code beside it. Tim recognized Carlos's system, a star for someone acting nervous, a squiggle for overheard gossip, a question mark for unknowns. At the bottom, one name stood alone, Harmon, ringed in red. "Principal's got something to hide," Carlos murmured. "Caught him talking to Officer DeWitt out by the loading dock before first bell. Didn't look friendly." Tim nodded, slipping the note into his pocket as Wendy appeared at his side, her hair wind-blown even indoors. She carried her notebook pressed tight to her chest. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Tim met her gaze, steady, unreadable, and felt the weight of last night's promise settle between them. "Let's do this." Their first stop was the English department office. The door was propped open, but the room was empty except for Ms. Geller, who typed furiously at her laptop. She glanced up as they entered, suspicion flickering behind her glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice clipped. "We're doing a history project," Tim lied smoothly, "about Ashgrove faculty through the years. Did you know Mr. Hargrove well?" Ms. Geller's fingers stilled on the keys. "We shared a wall for 10 years. He kept odd hours, always grading late or prepping lessons after everyone else left. She hesitated. He was kind, private. Wendy stepped forward, voice soft but insistent. Did he ever mention anyone bothering him or seem worried lately? Ms. Geller's lips pressed into a thin line. He was tense last week, more than usual. Kept checking his phone during lunch. I thought it was family trouble. She looked down at her hands, twisting a gold ring. But he never said. Tim watched her carefully, noting how she avoided their eyes. Did you notice anything strange on Friday? She shook her head slowly. He left early, said he had an errand before heading home. Her gaze sharpened suddenly. Why do you ask? Wendy offered a faint smile. Sometimes small things matter more than people realize. They left before Ms. Geller could press further. Next came eavesdropping in less official spaces. The church basement where the food pantry volunteers gathered on Wednesdays. Carlos slipped in under pretense of helping his aunt restock canned goods. Tim and Wendy lingered near the stairs, listening through vents. He always brought apples for the kids, someone said. A woman Tim recognized as Mrs. Dorsey, the guidance counselor. Even when no one wanted them, replied another voice, Miss Leary, returned at last, but sounding brittle as glass. Maybe it was just habit, Mrs. Dorsey mused. Or guilt, Miss Leary muttered. A scrape of chairs, footsteps approaching sent Tim and Wendy fleeing up the stairs before they could hear more. Outside, Wendy scribbled in her notebook, apples equals habit or sign. Carlos caught up with them as they rounded the corner of the church lot, breathless from both haste and excitement. They're hiding something, he said flatly. Ms. Leary's lying about Friday night. I heard her tell Mrs. Dorsey she went straight home, but Maya saw her car parked by Miller's Woods. Tim frowned. Why lie about that? Carlos shrugged. Maybe she met Hargrove there. Wendy closed her eyes briefly, as if tuning into some frequency beyond their hearing. Or maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Back at school, they reconvened in a deserted science lab, Wendy's idea since her mother's classroom was empty during third period. Tim spread out Carlos's coded notes and Wendy's spirals across a lab table sticky with decades of chemical spills. All right, Tim began, channeling his best detective persona. Let's piece this together. Hargrove leaves early Friday, brings apples even when nobody wants them, which fits Wendy's riddle, and meets someone in Miller's Woods or at the barn. Carlos tapped a finger against Ms. Leary's name on his list. She's hiding something about that night. Wendy added quietly, but she isn't the only one. Tim looked up sharply. Who else? Wendy traced a spiral with her fingertip, not meeting his eyes. Principal Harmon is afraid of what people might find out. Carlos leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. You think Harmon did something to Hargrove? Wendy shook her head slowly. Not directly, but he knows more than he admits. A heavy silence settled over them as thunder rumbled distantly, a ghost of last night's storm. Tim broke it with a sigh. So what now? We can't exactly accuse the principal without proof. Carlos grinned slyly. Good thing I've got friends everywhere. He pulled out his phone and dialed quickly. Maya? It's Carlos. Yeah, I need a favor. He wandered out into the hall as Wendy and Tim exchanged uneasy glances. Wendy spoke first. You don't have to trust me all the way. Her voice was so quiet, Tim almost missed it over the hum of fluorescent lights. He swallowed hard. Searching her face for answers she never gave freely. I want to, he admitted, more honest than he intended. Wendy smiled, a real one this time, fleeting and uncertain, but there all the same. Carlos returned minutes later triumphant. Maya says Harmon called a meeting with Officer DeWitt Friday night, late after everyone else had gone home. He waved his phone like a winning lottery ticket. She swiped a copy of the maintenance log. They signed in together at 9:47 p.m., left an hour later. Tim frowned. Why meet so late? And why bring DeWitt? Wendy murmured, to keep things quiet or cover up something that happened after school hours. Carlos nodded grimly. I say we talk to DeWitt ourselves. Tim hesitated, glancing at Wendy for guidance, but she only shrugged as if to say the wind can't help us here. After lunch, they found Officer DeWitt loitering by the gym entrance, chatting idly with Coach Taylor while keeping an eye on passing students. Carlos led the charge, shoulders squared, voice easy as ever. Hey, Officer D, got a sec? DeWitt raised an eyebrow, but nodded warily. What's up? We're working on a project about Ashgrove history. Carlos lied smoothly. He'd learned from Tim's earlier approach and wondered if DeWitt remembered giving him detention last semester for skateboarding in the halls. DeWitt grunted noncommittally. Tim jumped in. "We heard you were here late Friday night with Principal Harmon. Was something wrong?" DeWitt stiffened slightly, but hid it behind a shrug. "Just routine security check after some reports of trespassers near Miller's Woods." His gaze flickered to Windy and lingered there, a look not quite friendly. Windy held his stare without flinching. "Did you see Mr. Hargrove that night?" DeWitt shook his head too quickly. "Nope. Last time I saw him was Thursday afternoon." Carlos pressed on. "Did Harmon seem upset or nervous?" DeWitt shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable now. "Look, I don't know what rumors you've heard, but Mr. Hargrove was a good man." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people get caught up in things bigger than themselves." A warning or just regret? Windy watched him intently until he looked away. "Thanks for your time," Tim said politely as DeWitt turned back to Coach Taylor with obvious relief. They walked away in silence until they reached the stairwell behind the gym. A forgotten door propped open by a battered trash can. Carlos gestured toward it with a wicked grin. "Ever been on the roof?" The rooftop was deserted, just battered HVAC units and gravel crunching under their sneakers as they climbed through the access hatch into sharp sunlight and wind that tugged at their clothes. For a moment, none of them spoke. Ashgrove sprawled below them, quiet houses, distant fields, schoolyard rumors carried on invisible currents. Tim finally broke the silence. "We're running out of leads." Carlos looked out over town and shook his head stubbornly. "We're closer than anyone else has ever gotten." Windy perched on the edge of a low wall and looked directly at Tim, her expression more open than he'd ever seen it. "There's something I haven't told you," she said softly. Carlos whirled around, mouth already open with protest, but Windy held up a hand for silence. "I listen because I have to," she continued quietly. "It started when I was little. I'd hear things nobody else did. Secrets people whispered to themselves when they thought they were alone. Regrets carried by wind through open windows. Wishes tangled in leaves." She glanced down at her hands, twisting them together nervously. "My grandmother called it listening to ghosts, but I think it's just paying attention to what everyone else ignores." She looked up at Tim then, really looked, and her voice trembled on the edge of confession. "It gets loud sometimes, too loud to sleep or think or be normal." She took a shaky breath. "That's why we moved so much. My mom thought new places would make it quieter." She laughed bitterly. Carlos and Tim both heard how close she was to tears. "But Ashgrove is louder than anywhere else I've ever been." A long silence stretched out between them, the wind roaring in their ears like applause or accusation. Tim stepped forward until he stood beside her on the wall, not touching but close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. "I believe you," he said quietly, not because it made sense, but because it felt true in this moment above everything else. Carlos let out a long breath and sat down heavily beside them both. "I don't get it," he admitted gruffly, "but I'm not going to call you crazy either." Windy smiled through unshed tears, a smile full of gratitude and relief, and something softer that made Tim's heart twist painfully in his chest. They sat together in silence for a while, three unlikely allies bound by secrets and storms and promises made in barns and on rooftops alike, watching clouds tumble across an endless blue sky as Ashgrove churned with rumors far below. Finally, Windy spoke again, her voice steadier now. "If we want answers, we have to listen to everything." Chapter 7. When the Wind Speaks. The first warning arrived in the form of a single sheet of notebook paper, folded once and slipped through the slats of Tim's locker door. He found it on Thursday morning, just before first bell, a time when the halls of Ashgrove High were thick with yawns, coffee breath, and the residue of unslept dreams. The note was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar and jagged. "Stop asking about things you don't understand. Some secrets are better left alone." Tim stood there for a moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, feeling as if the words themselves might combust. He glanced around. No one seemed to be watching, but the usual background hum of gossip felt suddenly charged, as if the air itself knew something had changed. He crumpled the note and shoved it deep into his backpack, then made his way toward first period. His skin prickled with unease. By lunchtime, the news had spread. Carlos had been called out of class by Principal Harmon for a chat. When Tim finally found him in the courtyard, Carlos's usual swagger was dampened, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "They want us to stop," Carlos muttered, not meeting Tim's eyes. "Harmon said I was making people uncomfortable with all my questions. Told me if I kept poking around, he'd call my parents." "He can't do that, can he?" Tim asked. Low. Carlos shrugged. "Doesn't matter. My mom already thinks I'm one step from expulsion." He kicked at a loose stone on the path. "But it's not just him. Mrs. Dorsey caught me in the hall and told me to let sleeping dogs lie, like she's rehearsed it." Tim frowned, anger and anxiety warring in his chest. Someone's scared we're getting close. Carlos looked up at him then, something fierce in his eyes. Or someone wants us to be scared. Before Tim could respond, Wendy appeared beside them as if conjured by the breeze, her hair wild as ever, her gaze sharp. "You both got warnings," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Tim nodded, lowering his voice. "Did you?" Wendy hesitated. "Not from adults." She glanced toward the far edge of the courtyard, where a knot of students watched her with open suspicion. "But people are talking. They think I know what happened to Mr. Hargrove. They think I'm dangerous," Carlos snorted. "You? Please, you're just weird." Wendy smiled faintly, but her eyes were haunted. Weird is easier than being right. The three stood together in uneasy silence, the wind swirling around their ankles like a warning. After school, they gathered at Book Nook, Tim's safe haven since childhood, and now their unofficial headquarters. The store was quiet except for the hum of an old floor fan and the rhythmic tap-tap of Tim's mother shelving hardcovers near the window. Tim spread out everything they'd collected: Carlos's coded notes, Wendy's spirals and riddles, the scrap of Hargrove's scarf, now sealed in a plastic bag, and the threatening note from his locker. "Let's go over it again," Tim said, trying to impose order on chaos. "Hargrove leaves early Friday, brings apples even when no one wants them, meets someone at the barn. Ms. Leary lies about where she was that night. Harmon has a secret meeting with Officer DeWitt after hours." Carlos tapped his finger on the scarf scrap. "Someone wanted us to find this, but who?" Wendy's voice was barely above a whisper. "The wind keeps circling back to trust, to who you let close enough to hurt you." Tim looked at her sharply. "Do you think someone Hargrove trusted betrayed him?" Wendy nodded slowly. "That's what it feels like." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening for something beyond their hearing. Carlos leaned back in his chair, frustration etched across his face. "I'm tired of riddles," he muttered. Wendy opened her eyes, meeting his gaze head-on. "So am I." Friday came heavy with expectation and dread. Ashgrove High buzzed with talk of that night's football game against their bitter rivals from Elmwood. Banners hung limp in the muggy air. Teachers tried to enforce order but couldn't quite mask their own nerves. Tim moved through classes in a fog, his thoughts looping through every clue, every conversation, every look that lingered too long or didn't linger at all. By last period, he'd made up his mind. He found Wendy by the windows at the end of the math wing, staring out at the football field where players were already milling in anticipation. "We need to finish this," Tim said quietly. Wendy glanced at him sideways, her expression unreadable. "Tonight, everyone will be distracted," Tim said. "If someone's hiding something, they'll be here." She nodded once, her fingers tightening on her notebook. Sunset painted Ashgrove gold and crimson as crowds flooded the stands for Friday night lights, the ritual heartbeat of small-town life. Parents in folding chairs sipped coffee from thermoses. Students clustered beneath banners and string lights. Teachers huddled near the concession stand, as if proximity could protect them from rumor or revelation. Tim threaded through the chaos with Wendy at his side and Carlos trailing behind, his hands jammed deep in his pockets, eyes scanning for threats or allies. They'd agreed, watch for anything out of place, anyone acting nervous, anyone avoiding their gaze. The game roared on above them, cheers rising and falling like waves. But beneath the bleachers was a different world, shadows thick with cigarette smoke and whispered bets, couples pressed close for privacy, janitors swapping stories over lukewarm coffee. Here, secrets lived in plain sight, Wendy paused suddenly, tilting her head as if tuning into an invisible frequency. "Someone's here," she whispered. Carlos glanced around warily. "Who?" Wendy didn't answer. She just started moving deeper into the maze of girders and concrete pilings beneath the stands. Tim followed without hesitation, heart hammering against his ribs. They found Ms. Leary first, half hidden in shadow near a stack of folding chairs, her face streaked with mascara and fear. She jumped when she saw them. "What are you doing down here?" Tim stepped forward gently. "Ms. Leary, we know you lied about Friday night." Her eyes darted between them, desperate for escape. "I didn't do anything," she whispered fiercely. Wendy spoke softly. "You saw something you weren't supposed to." Ms. Leary crumpled then, shoulders shaking as she pressed a hand to her mouth. "I saw Hargrove arguing with Harmon," she choked out. "Near Miller's Woods, late Friday. I thought it was just another disagreement about curriculum or budgets or—" She broke off, sobbing quietly. Carlos knelt beside her. "Did you see what happened next?" Ms. Leary shook her head helplessly. "I left before it got ugly, I swear." Tim exchanged a look with Wendy. So much for answers. But Wendy was still listening, not to Ms. Leary now, but to something else entirely. Her gaze distant, her breath shallow. "The wind says there were more witnesses," she murmured. Carlos frowned. "Who?" Wendy turned suddenly, eyes fixed on a dark corner where two figures loitered, a custodian named Joe, always overlooked, and Mrs. Dorsey herself. They froze when they realized they'd been spotted. Tim squared his shoulders and approached, voice steady despite his racing heart. "We know you were there that night," he said quietly to Joe. Joe looked ready to bolt, but Mrs. Dorsey put a hand on his arm. "It's time," she said softly. She turned to Tim, Wendy, and Carlos, all pretense stripped away by exhaustion and guilt. "You want to know what happened?" she asked flatly. They nodded as one. Mrs. Dorsey drew a shaky breath. "Hargrove found out about Harmon skimming money from the school budget, money meant for scholarships and supplies." Her voice trembled with fury and regret. "He threatened to go public unless Harmon confessed." Joe picked up the thread, voice rough. "Harmon told him to meet at Miller's Woods, to talk it over. I heard them yelling from my car. Then Harmon stormed off toward Holloway Road." Carlos leaned forward urgently. "And Hargrove?" Mrs. Dorsey looked away. "He never came home." A silence fell, thick with grief and relief and disbelief all tangled together. Tim tried to process it all. Betrayal by someone meant to protect. Secrets traded for silence. A town willing to look away rather than face its own rot. Wendy broke the silence first, her voice clear and unwavering despite everything. "So now what?" Above them, cheers erupted as Ashgrove scored a touchdown. But down here in the shadows, 3 teenagers made a choice: to bring everything into the light. They led Mrs. Dorsey and Joe out from under the bleachers and across the field, past startled teachers and curious parents, to where Officer DeWitt stood guard near the main gate. It wasn't dramatic, no handcuffs or shouting or flashing lights, but by halftime word had spread. Principal Harmon was gone from his usual post on the 50-yard line. Police tape fluttered near Miller's Woods. Miss Leary was being comforted by half the English department. Mrs. Dorsey sat quietly on a bench, her face pale but resolute. For once, Ashgrove's secrets weren't just whispers. They were headlines waiting to be written. Later that night, after statements were given and rumors had already begun mutating into legend, Tim found Wendy sitting alone beneath the oak tree outside Book Nook, her notebook open on her knees. He sat beside her without speaking for a long time, listening to cicadas and distant sirens and the wind moving through branches overhead. Finally, he broke the silence. "I still don't understand how you do it." Wendy smiled, a real smile this time, weary but genuine. "Neither do I." Tim stared up at the stars peeking through tattered clouds. "I need things to make sense," he admitted quietly. "I need proof." Wendy closed her notebook gently and looked at him, not evasive now but honest in a way that left no room for riddles. "Sometimes trust means believing what can't be proved," she said softly. "Sometimes it just means listening, even when you're afraid of what you'll hear." He considered that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into something like peace inside him. "I believe you," he said at last, not blindly but with open eyes, not because he understood everything but because he understood enough. Wendy reached out then, her hand finding his in the dark, and together they sat beneath Ashgrove's restless sky, while new secrets gathered on winds yet unspoken. Beside them, Carlos sauntered up munching popcorn liberated from the concession stand, a crooked grin on his face despite everything that had happened. "You two done saving the world?" he teased gently. Tim squeezed Wendy's hand once before letting go, and together they rose to meet whatever storms would come next. Not as skeptics or oracles or social navigators, but as friends who had chosen trust over silence, truth over comfort, each other over fear. Somewhere overhead, a breeze rattled through oak leaves, carrying away old secrets and bringing new ones in their place. As Ashgrove exhaled at last and listened for whatever story would be told next on its ever-whispering wind. End of chapter 7.